Hi guys, in this video we will change and determine the cause of the malfunction ignition coil. What is an ignition coil? For a fire to occur, a spark is needed to ignite the air fuel mixture in the engine. This is the function of the ignition coil. It's an electrical transformer that converts the low voltage of the battery, usually just 12 volt, into a very high voltage so that the spark can slip through the spark plug gap to ignite the fuel. As a result, the engine starts. Same system requires only one coil, but most new car models have a separate ignition coil per cylinder. Although ignition coils are designed for long-term use, increasing demand on them means they can fail. Among the main reasons for the breakdown are the following. Possible cause of breakdowns. Actually, the reason for the failure of malfunction of the ignition coil are very diverse, but there are also a favorite among them. First of all, low quality candles are distinguished. Several candles splurge on a new rail. And in general, the quality of the completeness of combustion of the fuel-air mixture largely depends on the candles, and therefore savings are hardly appropriate here. Overheating of the engine, and especially a situation when the engine boils, can also cause of the ignition coil to fail. Therefore, if the situation arises, we are aware that such a problem may appear. Mechanical damage to the rubber tips of the ignition coil can cause breakdown. In such case, replacing the tip will completely eliminate the problems. Well, more exotic reasons for the failure of the ignition coil include flooding the car with water and starting another car with a faulty wiring. But here all the electronics and electric of the car can already fail. The repair of the ignition coil, in addition to the already mentioned replacement of the tips, is actually not performed. Indeed, who will rewind to real when is easier to change it. Therefore, if it's the ignition coil that has flown, then you should immediately prepare to replace it. Since the ignition coil is responsible for generating the spark that starts the car's engine, any malfunction of the coil will quickly affect engine performance. So the following things of malfunction of the ignition coil can be distinguished. Check engine light is on. Since a defective ignition coil will directly affect ignition performance. Any malfunction will cause the check engine light to come on. Increased fuel consumption. With a decrease in the spark power, the fuel combustion process will not be so efficient, which will lead to a noticeable increase in the consumption. Package in the exhaust system. Often an earlier scene of ignition coil failure is backfire, which occurs when fuel that has not been burned in the combustion chamber enters the exhaust system. If this problem is not corrected, the exhaust system can be severely damaged. Stopping the engine. A failure ignition coil will intermittently supply current to the spark plugs, which can cause of the engine to stall. It can also make it impossible to start the engine. Ignition misfire. Insufficient power from one or more cylinders can cause engine misfire, especially during acceleration. Problem with starting the engine. Likewise, if one or more of the spark plugs are not supplied the sufficient charge, the engine will be very difficult to start. Car with one ignition coil may not start at all in this case. In principle, there are several methods for checking the health of the ignition coil, but not all of these methods are safe. For example, it's advised to start the engine and disconnect the wire from each cylinder in turn. This will determine which coil is faulty. But such diagnostic can seriously damage or even disable the electronic ignition control unit. and then the repair will be much more complicated and most important expensive. You can take resistance measurement and a broken coil will give readings that are different from other and even from the norm typical for the system of the car. Well, professionals have special equipment that allow you to scan the entire electronic system of the car and determine where the breakdown or failure is hidden. The latter method, although somehow costly, is completely safe to the car. If the problem is not the coil itself, but the wiring, you can simply start the engine in the dark, raise the hood, and watch where the spark slips. But there is, as it were, not good about the coil. If the ignition of the coil body is broken, then the spark discharge will flow the path of least resistance. That is, the current indeed to ignite the fuel mixture in the cylinder will go to the nearest metal part connected to the mass of the car. The engine will react to misfire as follows. Will instable idle. The movement of the car will be accompanied by jerk. It will be difficult to start. There will be dips during overclocking. Pops are possible in the exhaust and inlet system. But there are symptoms of dying ignition coil when it's ground, but still works. In the era of complete failure of the ignition coil, the symptoms of the malfunction will be different, depending on how many cylinders it serves. And in conclusion, we can say that the service life of the ignition coil is influenced only by the condition in which it's operated. Change candles and wire in time. Don't flood the engine compartment with water. Monitor the condition of the electronic equipment. And, with possible, you will never have to change the coil.